Augsburg Confession 14, how it came to be and what has become of it in the Missouri Synod. St. Paul instructs Titus, "This is why I left you in Crete, in order that you might set aright what is lacking, and appoint elders, presbyters, in every town as I directed you." And then St. Paul then continues in that first chapter of Titus by listing all of the qualifications for those who would serve as in the office of overseer. And so the Holy Spirit teaches us that a congregation without a man placed into the pastoral office is incomplete. That a congregation that does not have a pastor is lacking. And the Augsburg Confession agrees. In Article 14 it states, "Our churches teach that no one should publicly teach in the church or administer the sacraments without a rightly ordered call." And the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in Article 2 of its Constitution accepts without reservation this confession as agreeing with the Holy Scriptures. And yet, in our churches, there are those who do publicly preach, teach, and administer the sacraments without a rightly ordered call. So how can this be? So the Augsburg Confession is compiled mostly from the material in the Marburg, the Schwabach, and the Torgau articles. The Augsburg Confession, however, was unique in that it included Article 14. It was chiefly a response to John Eck's 404 articles for the Imperial Diet at Augsburg, which aimed at enumerating those points of doctrine in the writings and teachings of various reformers deemed heretical. Under the heading New and Old Errors Now Given and Erring, Eck provides an extensive compilation of statements by Luther, commingled, of course, with that of other reformers. On ordination, a further subdivision, Eck includes just two. The Church of Christ does not know the sacrament of ordination, Luther, but it is a figment invented by human beings, Zwingli, Rhasis, and Amsterdo. All Christians, as many as are baptized, are equally priests, and any layperson can consecrate churches, confirm children, and so forth, Luther. So we should note two things. First, by mingling quotations from Luther with that of the enthusiasts, Eck insinuates that there is no difference between the two. And second, by stripping Luther's statements of their context, he suggests that Luther argues that ordination is superfluous. But in both these instances, Eck is drawing from Luther's discussion of ordination in the Babylonian captivity of the church. And one of the chief concerns of this treatise is to offer an analysis of the Roman sacramental system and its abuses. It's due to abuse that Luther writes, referring to ordination, "Of this sacrament the Church of Christ knows nothing." So Luther is attempting to free ordination from the baggage that accompanied the Roman designation of it as a sacrament, namely that a special grace and indelible character is bestowed. And so instead of sacrament, Luther prefers to call ordination a churchly rite, by which a man, having been called by the church to preach, teach, and administer the sacraments, is then publicly placed into that office of preaching, teaching, and administering. And so addressing the manner in which the Roman understanding of the priesthood of the called and ordained has diminished the priesthood of the baptized, Luther too here is concerned and objects to the subjection of the laity, what he calls the priesthood of the baptized, to the domination of the clergy, the priesthood of the called and ordained. All of those who have been baptized Luther would say, are priests. But not all baptized priests are authorized to preach, to teach, and to administer the sacraments. Only those who have the consent of the whole church have been so authorized. Ordination then follows. It is not dispensable. The call of the church gives a specific individual authority to preach, to teach, to administer the sacraments, and ordination, according to Luther and the Babylonian captivity, is the churchly rite through which one is placed into that office. And so Augsburg Confession 14 confronts both of these issues that Eck brings forward. It addresses Eck's insinuations, while at the same time it clarified Luther's own statements. No one is to preach, teach, or administer the sacraments apart from being rightly called. That is, being called to and being placed in the office of the ministry. As you'll hear when Pastor Curtis comes up, a lot of this ordination talk is an argument over words. And what do we mean? How we are defining it here is it doesn't matter if you have laying on of hands, it doesn't matter how it happens. A guy has to be called and he must be placed into the office of the ministry. And so that's how we're dealing with it in this conference. And so the specificity in AC 14 is remarkable. The verbs allow for no option. In fact, they're the same verbs used to talk about the indispensable nature that relationship between good works and faith. That you cannot have good works without faith. You cannot have faith without good works. So also, no one must, no one shall preach, teach, or administer the sacraments without being rightly called. Now, the Roman response to the Augsburg Confession came in Eck's confutation. AC 14 was received only insofar as rightly called was understood to refer to those called according to the laws and ecclesiastical ordinances that have been observed throughout Christendom, and that it was not a practice by which the mob selected their own leader. Throughout the Book of Concord, then, the issue of ordination, that is, the issue of calling and placing a man into the office, will be framed around these terms. To whom was it given to select a pastor? In other words, did the congregation have a say with regard to who would serve them? Then never is the question of ordination framed around whether those who will preach, teach, and administer the sacraments are to be placed into the office of preaching, teaching, and administering the sacraments. That is assumed. The question that we are dealing with, they did not. Their stance is clear, that no one must preach, teach, or administer the sacraments without being called to and placed into the office. Unless, of course, by some Odyssean trickery, a no one here is actually a someone. So on the question of calling and placing a man into the office, the position of Rome placed all authority to do that, to choose clergy in the office of bishop. The Lutheran confessors were fine with that, but they insisted that the assent of the congregation be included in this selection because the church is both clergy and laity alike. Not one or the other, but both. So the calling of a man and a placing of him into the office of the ministry was to be done by the whole church, clergy and laity together. And so in Article 14 of the Apology, Melanchthon professes a willingness to abide by the canonical order instituted by the Church Fathers, but in some places they are not able to. In fact, they must not, because The cruelty of the bishops, which will not allow the gospel to be preached, is there. He wrote, "Concerning this subject, we have frequently testified that in the assembly that is our greatest desire to retain the order of the church and the various ranks in the church, even though they were established by human authority. We know that church discipline, in the manner described by the ancient canons, was instituted by the fathers for a good and useful purpose. However, the bishops compel our priests either to reject and to condemn the kind of doctrine that we have confessed, or by new and unheard cruelty, they kill the unfortunate and innocent people. This prevents our priests from acknowledging such bishops. Thus, the cruelty of the bishops is the reason for the abolition of canonical order in some places, despite our earnest desire to retain it." And so ordination itself, that is the calling of a man and a placing of the man into the office, is not the primary issue in the confutation or the apology. They are not arguing over whether the one preaching, teaching, and administering is called to and placed in the office. Eck never accused the Lutheran confessors of having an insufficient doctrine of ordination, nor does Melanchthon seize the opportunity to address the problems with the Roman theology. The issue that Eck is concerned with is not ordination, but with oversight, with supervision, with control. He was content so long as the Lutheran reformers' priests submitted to the canons of the church and the oversight of the bishops. Now, that's going to be key later. So we move to the treatise. In the treatise on the power and primacy of the Pope, Melanchthon cites an example that some have misconstrued as an exception to AC XIV. The account was handed down by Augustine, who imagined a circumstance where one was not held to abide by the normal method. Augustine envisioned an instance where two people, one a catechumen, the other baptized, are in a damaged and sinking boat. It's called the naufragium. The resolution to the problem, Augustine suggested, is that the latter baptizes the former, and then the baptized absolves his baptizer. From this example, the following hypothesis has then arisen. Since there is no churchly rite of ordination, as Luther called it, here is a clear example of one preaching, teaching, and administering the sacraments without being rightly called. Now, the context of Augustine's naufragium account has been lost because the letter to Fortunatus, in which it was included, is no longer extant. It only exists through a reference by Gratian where he treats baptism in his decretals. In his treatment of baptism, Gratian examines a number of extraordinary circumstances in which one's baptism may be attacked by doubt. In these cases, Gratian does not address the question of who could or should or must baptize. He only seeks to answer the question, what can be said about these baptisms? And in this, he relies heavily upon Augustine and his view that a sacrament's validity rests on the never unsuccessful word rather than on its administrator. So Melanchthon utilizes this example to express his point that the authority to preach, teach, and administer sacraments has been given to the whole church, clergy and laity together, and not to bishops only. And since the Christian in Augustine's naufragium is baptized, the church is present. Matthew 18:20 applies to these two gathered in Christ's name. This is also a life or death situation in which one would act as he normally would not. In such cases of need, a layman, according to Melanchthon, does not merely act or perform the duties or functions of one who is rightly called. Melanchthon states, he actually becomes the pastor of the other for that specific situation. Treatise 67. However, there is no logical necessity that one may go from a particular to a universal, that is, from a specific emergency situation to a universal principle and application. So in other words, just because the laity may baptize in a life or death situation does not mean that he may baptize whenever he pleases. But in this instance, Melanchthon states that AC 14 is actually upheld, that there is not an exception here, right? That he is acting as the pastor. He is the pastor for that situation. An analogy would be if I saw Jeff Boyle's kid almost get hit by a bus. I'm not his father, but in that situation, I would certainly take up the duty of father and push him out of the way. But that doesn't mean I can take up the duty of father whenever I want, at least with his kid. So Luther also, in a few instances, faces and gives advice about problems for congregations that don't have pastors. So Luther and the Bohemians, and Luther and John Sutil. The Bohemian Church had lost its archbishop because they had held to the teaching of Huss in receiving the sacrament in both kinds. To be rightly called in the Bohemian Church was required that they had to travel to Italy and vow to give the Holy Communion in only one kind. Luther advised the Bohemians not to submit to papal authority, but instead he gave these two alternatives. He said, first, that the head of the households should baptize and teach the members of their own house in the Christian faith, and that these men would not administer the Lord's Supper or act as though they were rightly called, but only provide for those given into their care as the head of the house that God had given to them in their vocation. The second option offered was for each congregation in Bohemia to elect their own ministers to serve them. So Luther wrote, "Then call and come together freely as many as have been touched in heart by God to think and judge as you do. Proceed in the name of the Lord to elect one or more whom you desire, and who appear to be worthy and able. Then let those who are leaders among you lay hands upon them and certify and commend them to the people and the church or community. In this way, let them become your bishops, ministers, or pastors." So in both of these cases, Augsburg Confession 14 is actually upheld. With respect to the former, the head of the household does not act publicly, that is, for the sake of the people. He's there acting only within his vocation as any father or head of household would do. Nor does he administer the sacrament of the altar. In the latter, the church elects and ordains a man who is then, through that electing and ordaining, rightly called. In other words, a guy is actually called and placed into the office. With regard to Johann Sutil, who's living in Göttingen, he was serving as a minister even though he had not been ordained, placed into the office. He requested advice from Luther regarding his status. Sutil inquired whether he should submit to papal ordination or continue without ordination. Luther responded by instructing him not to be bothered with the unction and tonsure of papal ordination, but instead publicly, before the altar, by the rest of the ministers, and with prayer and the imposition of hands, you may receive the witness and authority to administer the supper, but refrain for a short time. Right? To make the distinction that you weren't in it and now you are. So here too, Augsburg Confession 14 is upheld. It remains for Luther that churchly rite through which one is rightly and orderly called, someone who is called and placed into the office. All right, so now we get to the current situation I'm skipping over Walther and all of those guys because Luther kind of, in his Babylonian captivity, summarizes Walther's points, right? That there's a distinction between the priesthood of the baptized and the priesthood of the called and ordained. So one significant document in the LCMS's confession of the ministry came from the CTCR entitled The Ministry, Offices, Procedures, and Nomenclature. Under the question, are certain functions in the church limited to the office of the public ministry? It says, however, in exceptional circumstances or in emergencies, as when a pastor is incapacitated, members of auxiliary offices or others qualified individuals may temporarily be called upon to perform under proper supervision functions that are otherwise performed by the pastor and that are not for other reasons precluded. For example, women teachers or deaconesses preaching in the public service. So note well here, supervision will be emphasized in many forthcoming documents. And the implication will eventually be made that the supervision of one carrying out the duties or the functions is synonymous with the supervisor doing it himself. In 1983, the Synod and Convention restructured its classification of ministers to include certified professional church worker lay. Those who found a place under this classification consisted of deaconesses, lay ministers, parish workers, parish assistants, so on and so forth. The resulting bylaw, as a consequence of the passage of this resolution, read, Male lay ministers are licensed, not ordained, to serve in all areas of the ministry of the word when authorized by a local congregation and supervised by an ordained pastor. Okay, so supervision then is a key. But other peripherals now are drawn into the process. The congregation now plays a role, and the language of licensed and authorized is used instead of called and ordained, rightly called or orderly called. There is mention of the ministry of the word, but nothing of the sacraments. But it is not what is included that is instructive, it's what's not. There is no reference to what the Lord in his scripture actually has mandated or instituted. Nothing about apostolic practice, nor anything about what the confessions state. Now, the most significant departure from Augsburg Confession 14 came with the adoption of Resolution 3-05B by the 1989 LCMS Convention in Wichita, the so-called Wichita recension of the Augsburg Confession. This action was the product of the work of the Lay Worker Study Committee and undertaken by the request of the 1986 LCMS Convention. Using a precedent-setting paradigm, namely the temporary licensure to preach and lead worship given to those preparing for ordination, vicars, the report surmises the concept of a licensing program is one which is not foreign to the practice of the Synod. So Augsburg Confession 14 is explicitly addressed in the report as follows. In accordance with AC 14, every congregation of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, by virtue of its synodical membership, has agreed to fill the divinely instituted office of the public ministry in its midst with a pastor, or pastors, or vacancy, interim pastor, from the clergy post roster of the Synod. Under his spiritual supervision, various functions normally carried out by other ordained or commissioned ministers, consecrated lay workers, or lay leaders, such delegation shall be done by the pastor under the authority granted by the congregation in his call and or by action of the congregation itself in order to fulfill the mission and ministry of the congregation. Oh, there it is, sorry. So here we see once again that Augsburg Confession 14 is violated when either supervision is present or congregation gives official approval. What is new here, though, is that there is no mention of extraordinary circumstances like we had in the previous ones, or emergency situations. Preceding this statement, there is the assertion that the focus and priority of all we do in the church, whether in outreach or in nurture, ought to flow out of our Lord's Great Commission. And so the remaining conclusions are predictable. The emphasis on the Great Commission, the language at least, tends to be on the result and the getting of results instead of what the Lord actually gives in the commissioning of the apostles in the closing verses of Matthew. The recommendations of the report were adopted at the 89 convention. These were listed under 3 headings: forms of lay ministry, which included provisions for the education of lay ministers under both the previously approved programs within the Concordia University system, as well as local and district level training; nomenclature, allowing for the continuance of current titles with the addition of deacon, a title reserved for those temporarily serving in word and sacrament ministry, in exceptional circumstances or in emergencies; and finally, guidelines for congregations regarding the performance of pastoral functions when no ordained pastor is available. Under the guidelines section, and after affirming AC 5 and 14, the resolution continues. Therefore, only those who hold the office of the public ministry should exercise distinctive functions of this office. However, when no pastor is available and in the absence of any specific scriptural directives to the contrary, congregations may arrange for the performance of these distinctive functions by qualified individuals, lest God's people be deprived of the opportunity for corporate worship and the celebration of the sacraments. Specific instructions for the implementation of this resolution are given in 4 areas. As for preaching, individuals chosen by the congregation or its leadership may read a sermon written by a pastor, and sermons may only be composed by those who are licensed by the district and under the supervision of one who is rightly called and ordained. Such licenses were only temporary, and they must be renewed. As for service in the liturgy, this must be approved by the supervising pastor and be acceptable to the congregation. As for the sacraments, baptism was to be administered by one who was rightly called and ordained, unless this is not possible. The Lord's Supper is only administered by those not called and ordained in exceptional circumstances, and then only with the authorization of the congregation and the supervision and approval of the pastor and the district president. The forgiveness of sins, however, was specifically denied to this licensed individual when it is in the context of church discipline. In an attempt to allay any concerns, Samuel Nafsker addressed the convention with these remarks. We have many dedicated lay ministers who for up to 20 years have been asked to carry out a ministry of word and sacrament without recognition or supervision, without roster or doctrinal oversight. If we want to undermine Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession, the surest way is to leave things as the way they are, and to have no accountability or supervision. The adoption of Resolution 3-05 does not initiate a single new practice in the doctrine of the ministry of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. It will, however, initiate proper supervision of those practices which we have long recognized as being consistent with our understanding of the doctrine of the ministry, so that we may all together tell everyone what he has done. Emphasis original. So now we finally have clarity. Right? The purpose for this resolution was to justify the practices that have already been occurring.
Yep.
But more than that, it shows a gross misunderstanding of AC 14. AC 14, as I mentioned earlier, was never concerned about issues of oversight. It was not concerned about supervision, not even proper education. It was not included for the purposes of accountability. It was included to ensure that everyone who publicly preaches, teaches, and administers the sacraments is rightly called to and placed in the office of the ministry, having, in other words, the Holy Trinity's authorization to do it and the Church's request. Oversight and supervision were not on the minds of the Lutheran reformers. Oversight and supervision was the main concern of Eck and of Rome, only allowing the reformers to have their pastors so long as they had sufficient oversight. For Eck and for Rome, certainty resided in the supervision of the bishops, who were such in accordance with the laws and ecclesiastical ordinances that have been observed throughout Christendom. And is that not exactly what we have here? The passing of this resolution, a resolution to ensure that the proper ecclesiastical laws and ordinances are in place, isn't this tantamount to running back to Rome and forsaking the Augsburg Confession altogether?
Amen.
The action taken at Wichita in '89 generated a considerable response the next time Synod met in convention. There were no less than 21 overtures dealing with Resolution 3-05B in the 1992 Convention Workbook. Both seminaries addressed the issue, as well as entire districts and many individual congregations. Some simply asked for further study, while others requested that lay ministers be called and ordained in accordance with AC 14. The only action taken was to ease the colloquy process for those who had served 10 years or more in Word and Sacrament ministry as licensed only. Lay ministry also came up in '95, and during its proceedings it was decided that those serving with only a license should be in the process leading to a call and ordination. Any individual serving as lay minister was given 2 years with which to apply to a seminary program, or else his license would be allowed to lapse. This was a significant step in the right direction, but unfortunately, this step was reversed in 2001 when the '95 resolution was rescinded and 3-05B from '89 was reinstated. In the 2004 Convention Workbook, then President Kieschnick, in his President's Report, articulated the '89 understanding of AC 14 when he quotes Sam Nasker. Kieschnick stated, "Since the office of the keys has been given by Christ immediately and originally to all Christians, lay people may be asked in cases of necessity and emergency situations to perform pastoral functions. But this should only be done in the prolonged absence of a rightly called pastor, lest there be a weakening of the pastoral ministry with all its benefits." At the '07 convention in Houston, Resolution 5-01B to establish the specific ministry pastor program was moved for adoption. In the background section provided by the committee, the need for the SMP program arose from contemporary mission challenges, which include the need to provide pastoral ministry in ways that go beyond the current residential models. Fine. Under the heading, Theological Foundations Guiding the Proposal, the resolution states first and foremost, 1, all those who regularly and publicly perform the functions of the office of the Holy Ministry should do so as those called to and placed into the office. End quote. Then the resolution quotes AC 14. It then continues, as it is true that the means of grace, the gospel and the sacraments, are the rightful possession of all believers in Christ as members of the priesthood of all believers, only the one office of the Holy Ministry is entrusted with the public exercise of these means. As such, we affirm that only those who are rightly and publicly called and ordained should publicly exercise the functions which are entrusted to this ministry. Eventually, after much discussion, the resolution was adopted by an 80% majority of the voting delegates. Despite the controversy surrounding the level of education an SMP pastor would receive, this was at least a move in the right direction to bring LCMS practice into harmony with AC XIV. Level of education is not the issue in AC XIV. Being called to and being placed into the office is. However, the discussion and adoption of the next resolution to be considered by Committee 5, Resolution 5-02 to address licensed lay deacons, was an exercise in schizophrenia. The proposed resolution called for a task force to study those currently serving as licensed lay deacons to determine whether there continues to be a genuine need for this program within the synod. During the discussion, a substitute resolution was offered. It read, "Resolved that all laymen licensed by synodical or district programs to conduct word and sacrament ministry be enrolled in the specific ministry pastor program by August 1st, 2009, or such licensure shall be rescinded." Despite the affirmation by an 80% majority in the previous resolution that only those who are rightly and publicly called and ordained should publicly exercise the functions which are entrusted to this ministry, this amendment was defeated. The original resolution passed. Meanwhile, waiting on the desks of the pastoral delegates as they returned home from the convention was the July issue of Concordia Journal, in which the systematics faculties from both seminaries had written a joint statement on condemning lay ministry. By then, however, it was too late. At the 2010 convention, the study and recommendations from the task force that the 2007 convention called for in Resolution 5-02 was presented. It noted 8 distinct categories of descriptions of the service rendered by lay deacons. The task force then agreed which of those categories required one to be called and ordained in accordance with AC XIV. The categories are as follows. I'm not going to read all of these. So there are 8. The first 5, you have to be called and ordained. The last 3, which is kind of what we're going to be dealing with, they said no. But you can see what some 500 and so lay deacons are currently serving, at least since 2010. The task force then gave 11 recommendations under 2 separate categories. I'll only highlight a few. Under the category of immediate implementation, the task force recommended that district deacon instructional programs should be retained. And under the category of implementation 6 months after the LCMS convention, the reason for the retaining of the district deacon instructional programs is given. District programs should be retained for A, equipping laity who wish to grow and be enriched for Christian life and service. B, preparation for men to demonstrate entry-level competence prior to SMP enrollment. C, forming individuals to serve in categories 6 through 8, right, those who don't need to be called and ordained, in local ministry sites. And D, preparation for men for category 1 through 5, word and sacrament ministry, in cases deemed to be exceptions by a committee of the LCMS Council of Presidents. And it says to see recommendation 3 below. In recommendation 3 below, the task force states, I'm sort of seeing cross-eyed after reading all these proceedings. In exceptional cases where a district president concludes that enrolling in a pastoral formation program offered by the LCMS seminaries, including SMP, is not a feasible means to form a candidate for category 1 through 5 service, A, the district president will request confirmation of this assessment by a designated committee of the Council of Presidents to authorize a graduate of a district program to serve in Word and Sacrament ministry. And B, within 3 years, a deacon serving in category 1 through 5 Word and Sacrament ministry will apply for examination and certification through the Synod's Colloquy Committee. Following successful completion of the examination process, he would be certified as eligible to receive a call to serve as an assisting pastor. So if those serving in categories 1 through 5 are not exceptional cases, the task force recommends that they enroll in one of Synod's pastoral formation programs offered by one of the seminaries, or examined by the Synod's Colloquy Committee, and upon successfully completing the examination, be certified as eligible to receive a call to serve as an assisting pastor and be ordained as such. Again, this is moving in the right direction. Nevertheless, when these recommendations came to the convention floor in the form of Resolution 5-03A to address lay deacons, the convention moved to refer it back to Committee 5 and was never brought back to the convention floor. Finally, at the 2013 convention in St. Louis, Resolution 4-06A to address questions regarding service of licensed lay deacons was brought to the floor by Committee 4. This resolution was formulated from 17 overtures submitted by 6 district conventions and 2 district pastors' conferences. One is Southern Illinois. It resolved that to promote and maintain unity of doctrine and practice, the president of Synod should establish a task force to establish a plan anchored in the Word in consultation with licensed lay deacons and those who supervise and are served by them, to resolve questions about the service of licensed lay deacons serving congregations in the LCMS with the Word and Sacraments of Christ. And it's to be reported at 1 year to the Synod, 1 year before the 2016 convention. It passed, and that report is now circulating. In fact, Pastor Curtis is going to present on it. Time and time again, the LCMS has made a category error in allowing AC 14 to be contravened. Augsburg Confession 14 was not included to ensure proper education or proper ecclesiastical supervision. Both of these are worthy endeavors that the scriptures maintain are good and that we should do, but they were not the concerns of the Lutheran confessors when they said that no one should teach publicly in the church or administer the sacraments unless properly called. Rather, they were interested in ensuring that the one preaching, teaching, and administering the sacraments were doing so as those called to and placed into the office of the ministry. So St. Paul taught Titus, a congregation without a pastor, without one called to and publicly placed into the office is lacking. Let us then set aright what is lacking in our midst. Thank you.